Once upon a time, there were 100 million people. They had different interests, different beliefs, different occupations, but for the most part, they got along pretty well. Then one day, a gang of a few hundred people showed up. Need to zoom in some more to see them. I know they're there somewhere. Zoom in. There they are. And this gang of a few hundred said to the throng of 100 million, "From now on, you all have to give us a cut of everything you earn."
This is an accurate graphical comparison between the number of American taxpayers and the number of U.S. congressmen.
And the throng said, "Gosh, do we have to give you a cut of what we earn?" And the gang of a few hundred said, "Yes, you have to." And the throng said, "Well, okay, I guess we have to." And one little troublemaker asked, "What if we don't?" The gang of a few hundred didn't like this, and said, "If you do not comply, we shall unleash upon you our legions of enforcers." And the throng cried, "Oh no, please don't. We will comply, we will pay."
This is an accurate graphical comparison between the number of American taxpayers and the total number of IRS employees.
Time went by, and the gang of a few hundred said, "Now we want more of what you earn." And this kept happening over and over again, until eventually some of the throng were paying almost half of what they earned to the gang. Whenever the gang demanded more, the throng would say, "Golly, we're already having a tough time. Do we really need to give you even more?" And the gang always said, "Yes, you must, or we shall unleash our legion of enforcers." Now the gang of a few hundred was getting trillions of dollars every year, spending it on wars and pyramid schemes, giving away goodies to their friends, buying influence, and doing lots of other things. And some of the throng started saying, "We don't really like the war you're waging with the money we give you. Do we really have to be paying for that?" And the gang said, "Yes, we demand it. Don't make us send out our legion of enforcers." And some of the throng said, "You're taking our money and giving it to huge corporations and giant banks, and some people who just don't want to work. A lot of these things we don't like." And the gang said, "We don't care. We will decide how to spend it. You just do as you're told, or else." And the throng said, "Okay, I guess we have to." But eventually the throng got so fed up, so angry, that they took a drastic step. One day they said to the gang, "We don't like what you're doing. We want a new gang." And after pouring a huge amount of time and money into the effort, they replaced the gang with a new gang. Then the throng pleaded with the new gang, "Now, at long last, can we keep our own money, or at least keep more of it?" And the new gang said, "Sorry, but after much discussion, we've decided that you can't. You have to keep giving us what you've been giving, in fact, a little bit more than before." The throng was distraught and said, "This is dreadful. But after all, what choice do we have? I mean, they say we must comply, and they have that scary legion of enforcers. We're powerless against them. We'd better just do as we're told." So they did as they were told, got poorer and poorer, and lived miserably ever after. But after all, what else could they have done? What power could this throng possibly have compared to this gang of a few hundred and their enforcers? What chance would this thing have against this thing? How could these 100 million people ever hope to successfully resist the awesome power of this tiny little dot? In case anyone missed this, let's review. Here's them. Here are their enforcers. Here's us. Them, us. Them, us. Does anything about this seem just a little strange to you? Are you perhaps wondering, why does the throng need the permission of the dot to do anything? Why do these people feel the need to ask this tiny little dot if they can keep more of what they earn? Why would they spend year after year literally begging for lower taxes from this little dot? Is this dot just really darn intimidating? Is it very persuasive in its reasoning? To be blunt, why would this throng give a rodent's backside what this tiny little dot wanted? The fact that this tiny dot has the gall to issue such demands to such a throng is pretty startling in and of itself. But what is far more amazing is that the throng obeys this minuscule little parasitic gang of control freaks. What could possibly explain this? Let's ask the dot. This is how it works. When we, the dot, take your money and spend it on things you don't like, we're representing you. In fact, though you're not allowed to actually keep your own money, you're allowed to decide which little dot will steal half of what you earn. So that really means that you're in charge and that you're agreeing to give us your money. In fact, we, the dot, are serving you when we take your money and spend it on things you don't like. And so you should thank us and treat us with great respect and honor for having robbed you on your behalf for your own good in order to serve you by doing things you don't want us to do. So there you have it. I hope that cleared everything up for you.
If you're not entirely satisfied with the dot's explanation of things, you really should read the book The Most Dangerous Superstition, available now at Amazon.com. If you were king.
So the world is a pretty messed up place. But just think how great it would be if you were in charge. If you were selected to be king of the world. Just think of all the good you could do if you were given unlimited power to make things right. You would make the world a veritable utopia. You could feed the poor and house the homeless and defeat the wicked and protect the innocent. You could save the world. Everyone would love you and thank you. If you just had the power, you could make everything fair and just and safe. Well, no, you couldn't. You might try and you might mean well, but any great and noble plans you had would soon fall apart, and you would turn into a tyrant. This isn't because you're stupid or because you're a bad person. Even if you're quite intelligent and have the best of intentions, all your effort to use your power for good would be an absolute, complete, and utter failure. Why? Well, let's consider a few examples.
Agenda item number 1, helping the poor.
Suppose, as a benevolent king, you decided to give lots of stuff to the needy, to help the poor. Surely that would be a noble thing to do and would make society better, wouldn't it? Well, no, and here's why. Whether it's a king, a Congress, or anything else, government doesn't create any wealth. Any wealth it gives away, it first has to take from somebody else. As king, before you could give anything to the poor, you'd have to take it from someone else. But suppose that someone else didn't want to hand it over. Whether he just wants to keep it himself or wants to give it away by himself, or thinks you do a bad job of it, if for any reason he didn't want to fund your plan, what would you do about it? If you're king, you don't just ask people nicely. Anyone can do that, but no one has to listen to them or cooperate. As king, you would be commanding people to fund your ideas. And those commands, if they're going to be any more than suggestions, will be backed by the threat of punishment for those who don't obey you. If some peasant doesn't think he can afford it, or doesn't trust you to spend it wisely, or just wants to keep his own money, what will you do about it? Just let it slide? Not if you want to have any power. If your subjects can ignore you without any consequences, then you have no power. So the peasant who wouldn't fund your plan must be punished and made an example of. Suddenly, you're not just benevolently giving stuff away, you're hurting people who don't want to do things your way. Whether you execute the peasant or imprison him or burn his house down or take some of his stuff, whatever, you'll be doing harm to him simply because he wouldn't let you take his money. Suddenly, being king isn't just about being caring and generous. It's not just about giving and helping. It's about controlling and punishing. It's about threatening and hurting people.
Agenda item number 2, Serving the common good.
Next, maybe you'd want to build public schools so your subjects' children could get a good education. And you'd build a big library and a public park and museums and zoos and a great road system and hospitals and all sorts of things that will benefit the people in general. And your people will love you for being so charitable and thoughtful. But again, how do you pay for it? Kings don't get castles and piles of gold by working hard. They get those things by taxing their subjects. Every penny you spend, whether you're spending it on yourself or on so-called public projects, you first have to take from your peasants. In reality, you're not giving them anything. You're merely spending their money for them. What if they wanted to spend it some other way? Well, if you let everyone spend his own money, you would have no power. Asking nicely won't do it. If some peasant wants to buy a bigger house instead of helping to pay for a library, or wants to buy more land or save for the future instead of chipping in for a public school, what will you do? If you do nothing and let him get away with that, all your power is gone. Again, to remain king, you have to punish those who won't fund your agenda. So not only are you merely buying the peasantry things with their own money, rather than giving them anything that actually belongs to you, but you're also threatening to cage or otherwise punish them if they resist your efforts to spend their money. You can loudly proclaim that it's for their own good and that your plan is better for the people as a whole, but if some of them don't see it that way, you're still going to have to send out your mercenaries to crush any dissenters.
Agenda item number 3, enforcing good choices.
So, trying to be a benevolent king by giving your subjects things that you bought with money you first stole from them turns out to be a lot less noble and less fun than you had expected. So you try a different approach. You decide to use your power and authority to make people live healthier lives. You require everyone to exercise for at least an hour a day and to eat a well-balanced diet. Undoubtedly, that would improve the health of many of your subjects. So how could they complain about that? What could be wrong with that? Well, what do you do if somebody disobeys? If some peasant won't eat his vegetables, what do you do about it? Ask nicely? Being in charge isn't about asking, it's about telling, it's about commanding. And a command isn't a command if there are no consequences for disobedience. So the non-compliant would have to be punished. Whether you take some of the peasant's money and call it a fine, or put him in prison, or have him publicly flogged, you will have to intentionally and publicly hurt him one way or another simply because he wouldn't follow your advice. If you ban smoking or drinking or using drugs or eating too much candy, there have to be adverse consequences to any peasant who disobeys. No matter how good you think your suggested choices might be, you're going to have your mercenaries forcibly punish in one way or another those who refuse to make the choices you think they should make, the choices you tell them to make. As a result, suddenly you're not just a helpful leader, you're a vicious thug. Even if the choices you're forcing people to make are what they should be choosing on their own anyway. Suddenly your good intentions, when combined with the exercise of power, become acts of violence. And suddenly your victims, your subjects, don't seem all that appreciative anymore. In fact, they seem to resent you and your supposedly benevolent agenda. But maybe you can still find a way to use your power for good.
Agenda item number 4, protecting the innocent.
What if, instead of trying to coerce your subjects into making good choices or funding useful projects, you stick to something more basic, just trying to protect the good people from any nasty crooks and thugs who might be living in your kingdom, which in this case is the entire planet. Surely there can't be anything wrong with that. If there is any way to use power for good, it has to be protecting the good from the wicked. So that's what you devote yourself to, confident that you'll finally make the world a better place as king. But again, your subjects don't have a choice about funding it. If they think your enforcers are abusive or corrupt, if they think your view of justice is skewed, if they don't think your protection services are worth the price, do you allow them to opt out? not if you want to remain king. The mercenaries you hire, the prisons you build, the army you create with its war machines, not all of your peasants will want it or will agree with how it functions. Do you just say, I know best and it's for your own good, and then lock up those who don't pay? Do you force your version of justice and security on them, force them to pay for it, and expect them to like it and thank you for it? To say that all you're doing is protecting people, while you're sending armed thugs to collect payments from people who don't want your so-called protection, makes you look more like the mafia than like a savior and protector. If some peasant wants to protect himself or wants to hire someone other than you and your goons to protect him, do you let him, or do you force him to fund your idea of justice and security? If a peasant doesn't like what your army does or how it does it, do you allow him to choose to not financially support your agenda? Again, retaining your power requires you to violently impose your agenda on your subjects, forcing them to fund it, crushing any resistance, and doing all of that in the name of defending them against thugs and thieves. And that's more than a little ironic. It's hard to feel noble and righteous, or even honest, while you're routinely committing aggression against people in the name of protecting them.
Agenda item number 5. Sit in your castle and do nothing.
Well, it seems your ambition of using your newfound unlimited power to fix the world hasn't turned out so well. You tried to do good stuff and be caring and compassionate, but everything just came out as threats and violence. Because after all, that's what law and government are. So in desperation, you decide to do nothing. You leave your subjects alone and you hide in your castle, sulking. But wait, how did you pay for the castle, and your guards, and all the luxuries you have? Even if you do away with most of it, whatever you end up with, are your subjects going to want to voluntarily pay for you to sit on your lazy butt while they deal with the challenges of reality on their own? Doubtful. So if you intend to continue in this life of luxury as king, you're still going to have to force your subjects to fund it. And that means even if you do nothing at all for the peasants, you're still going to need guards and an army and tax collectors just to remain king.
The punchline.
And that brings us to the final agenda item, the one you should have started with. When you were made king and appointed to be in charge of everything, you should have said no. When offered the opportunity to rule and command your fellow man, you should have turned it down. If given power over others, what you should have done with that power is nothing. Absolutely nothing. Because power via brute force cannot fix the world. Authoritarian control, whether wielded by a king or an elected government or a constitutional republic, cannot improve society. Why not? Because all such power by its very nature is nothing more than the ability to threaten people and hurt people. And whatever your intentions may be, you can't improve human society, you can't create peaceful civilization by threatening and hurting people. Shouldn't that be obvious, self-evident? Sadly, almost everyone has fallen for the utterly insane notion that the human race can be made more moral and more civilized by taking a few human beings and giving them permission to threaten and hurt, to forcibly rule and control everyone else. Such an idea is pure lunacy, no matter how popular it may be, and no matter how much rhetoric and how many excuses you pile on top of it. You can pontificate all you want about constitutions and elections, representative government, consent of the governed, and so on and so forth, but that won't change reality. And anyone who dares to objectively consider things for 5 minutes will see that the reality of the situation is this: authoritarian power, in any form, regardless of the goal or motives, is nothing more than the addition of more aggressive, immoral violence into society. It doesn't matter how many nice suits, fancy hats, grandiose buildings, and pompous rituals and ceremonies you use. Whether it comes from King You or a bunch of elected politicians, the power to rule is always and inherently diametrically opposed to the power of being human. Want to fix the world? Throw the crown away. Ignore politics. Don't threaten, attack, or rob your neighbor, and don't vote for anyone who offers to threaten, attack, or rob your neighbor on your behalf. Don't, by yourself or by way of those in power, try to force others to be what you wish they were, or force them to fund what you wish they would fund. Instead, try treating your neighbor as if he owns himself, because he does.
If you want a more thorough understanding of why the game called politics is always destructive and immoral, get a copy of The Most Dangerous Superstition, available at Amazon.com.
Mr. Jones owned a cotton plantation and many slaves. One day he was talking to the owner of the plantation next to his, and Mr. Jones was lamenting the fact that times were tough. He was having to work his slaves harder than ever, and was having trouble with some of them being disobedient or trying to run away. The other plantation owner said he knew someone who could help.
Day 1.
One day Mr. Jones called his slaves together so a man named Mr. Smith could talk to them. Before beginning, Mr. Smith whispered to Mr. Jones, "Whatever I say, do not contradict me or interfere, and I promise you your slave troubles will end." "My name is Mr. Smith," he said to the slaves, "and this may be the happiest day of your lives. From today forward, you will no longer be slaves, but free men." Mr. Jones was so shocked he started to step forward, but Mr. Smith gestured for him to remain silent. He did, only because the other plantation owner had spoken so highly of Mr. Smith's skills. "You are no longer the property of Mr. Jones," Mr. Smith continued. "You are free. No more would you be forced to labor for the benefit of Mr. Jones. Now you can work for yourselves." Now the slaves were all murmuring and looking at each other. Many were smiling, many were looking puzzled. "In fact, you are now free to leave the plantation whenever you want," Mr. Smith said. "However, since we are surrounded by other plantations, if you leave, some other plantation owner will likely claim you as his own the moment you set foot on his property. So I urge you not to risk your newfound freedom by doing something so foolish. Instead, I suggest that you stay here, no longer as slaves, but as willing participants and part owners of this plantation. Yes, this is now your plantation." Mr. Jones bit his tongue to keep from objecting. "For now, we might as well leave Mr. Jones in charge," said Mr. Smith, "since he is the only one with any experience at running a plantation, which is quite a complicated thing to manage. But he will no longer be your master, but just another worker on the plantation. In fact, he will now be using his organizational and management skills to serve you. Whatever problems you may have had with him before, you are now all equals, and you need each other to make this work. If we all cooperate and work together, we can all reap the benefits together. In honor of this happy occasion, I present you this new symbol of togetherness and cooperation, this flag, which shall be the emblem of the new, free Jones plantation." He held up the new flag, but most of those listening were still too amazed to respond. "And this shall be our motto," Mr. Smith announced. "We work together as free men for our mutual benefit, pledging our allegiance to the Jones plantation, which stands for prosperity, liberty, and justice for all. To celebrate, everyone has the rest of the day off. Enjoy your freedom, do as you please, and be back here tomorrow morning, bright and early, so that we may begin work on this great and noble new endeavor as equal free men." Finally convinced that Mr. Smith was serious, the former slaves applauded and cheered.
Day 2.
"We all want this plantation to do well," Mr. Smith said at the beginning of the next meeting, "so we can all share in the benefits. We all know that it takes a lot of effort to make a cotton plantation work. Just because you're all free doesn't mean you can stop working. In fact, since you're now working for yourselves, I expect you to work even harder than ever before, but now with pride and joy, knowing that you're working for yourselves. Of course, there still have to be rules. If everyone just does whatever he wants, the plantation won't produce anything. This experiment will fail, and we'll all starve. You should be thankful that Mr. Jones has agreed to stay on to lend his knowledge and skills to this endeavor, and I trust you will all do your own part to make this work. Several of you have been chosen to act as project supervisors to manage different aspects of the operation, to make sure everyone is doing his assigned job, to make sure that the rules are followed, and so on. The rest of you may head out to the fields to start your first day of work as free men."
Day 3.
The next morning, Mr. Smith had a grim expression on his face as the daily meeting began. "I have an unpleasant duty to do today," he said. Yesterday, Charles was caught keeping some of the cotton he picked, presumably to sell for his own personal profit. That is against the rules. That is stealing. For that, Charles must be punished. 2 men tied Charles to the whipping post. I take no joy in this, Mr. Smith continued, but you must understand, if we do not maintain order, if we do not have rules that we all abide by, then the plantation will fail, and we will all suffer. The whip cracked against Charles' back. But if we all pitch in for the common good, then we can all prosper. Being free doesn't mean you should be selfish and greedy. We must each do our assigned duties and obey the rules, and then we can all benefit, and each of you will receive your appropriate share of the profits. A young man named Samuel stepped forward. But if you and Mr. Jones decide the rules and whip us if we disobey, how is that any different from what we had before? How can you say that? Mr. Smith asked. I'm shocked. You were a slave before, and now you're free. Things still need to be managed and organized by those best qualified to do so. Do you know how to run a plantation, Samuel? Well, no, he answered. But if we're free, why do we get no say in what the rules are and how things work? I'm surprised at your ingratitude, Mr. Smith answered. None of you know how a plantation is run, so you're in no position to be making decisions about how things are done here. You don't seem to appreciate all the things that Mr. Jones provides for you, from protecting you from all the outside threats that you know nothing about, those who would come here, capture and enslave you, if not for Mr. Jones' protection, to making sure that you all have food and housing, tools to work with, that you're cared for when sick and injured, and so on. There wouldn't be a plantation at all, no cotton to pick, no land to plant and harvest, if not for him. You should be grateful that he's made possible the level of comfort you now have. Your lives would be far worse if not for him. Nevertheless, as free and equal participants in this endeavor, from now on at each meeting, any worker may have 2 minutes to ask questions or voice suggestions or complaints. With that, the workers all seemed satisfied and headed out again to the fields to pick the cotton.
Day 4.
I have a big announcement, Mr. Smith said as the daily meeting began. Mr. Jones' cousin is here, and not just to visit and see how our project is coming along. It has been decided that from now on, you will be deciding who will manage the plantation. Of course, this job can't be done by just anyone, but every 3 months we will have a special meeting at which all the workers will vote on whether we think Mr. Jones should run the plantation or whether we think his cousin, Mr. Johnson, should run the plantation. That means that ultimately you are in charge because you will be deciding which man you want running things on your behalf. If you don't like the way things are being managed, you now have the power to change it. Amazed and pleased, the workers headed out again to the fields to pick the cotton. Days passed, months passed, a year passed, and the plantation continued to operate as before. Sometimes Mr. Jones was in charge, sometimes Mr. Johnson was in charge, but the day-to-day routine stayed exactly the same. The workers worked hard, long hours every day, and still had little to show for it. Every day the meeting would begin with them all reciting the Jones Plantation motto, "We work together as free men for our mutual benefit, pledging our allegiance to the Jones Plantation, which stands for prosperity, liberty, and justice for all." One day Mr. Smith announced, "Samuel is asked to say a few words this morning, and whatever the rest of us may think of his ideas and opinions, we are all free here, and that means we are all allowed to speak our minds. So, Samuel, you have 2 minutes. Begin." Samuel stepped forward, looking scared. "I was excited when all this started," he began, glancing nervously at Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones. "But don't you all see what's happened here? Nothing has changed. We're all still slaves." There were grumbles of disagreement from the crowd. "They tell us what to do and whip us if we don't. They still make all the rules and punish us if we disobey. They let us make suggestions and complain about things, but they never really change anything. They let us choose between Mr. Jones and Mr. Johnson, but what's the difference? The situation stays the same. We do all of the work and they take as much as they want and decide how much they'll let us keep. They live in luxury, made rich by the cotton we pick. We do all the work and have to build our own huts, grow our own food, and take care of ourselves. They leave us just enough that we don't revolt or run away. This is not freedom. We're all still slaves. They've only changed the words they use, but nothing else has changed. They say we're all free and equal, but we're not. They command and we obey. That's not freedom. That's not equality. They say we're free to leave, but all that means is that we're free to be someone else's slave. Why should we work or obey the rules? We didn't agree to this. They made the system. They forced it on us. They control and rob us and call it freedom. They've deceived you into thinking that being able to choose which slave master you'll work for is the same as being free. It's not. Open your eyes. If you keep what you produce, they call it stealing. When they take what you produce, they call it sharing and fair distribution. Can't you see that this is all? Your time is up, Samuel, Mr. Smith announced calmly. At his gesture, two supervisors grabbed Samuel by the arms and led him to the whipping post. I'm sorry, Samuel, but you've broken the rules. There are rules against encouraging others not to work and encouraging others to break the rules. You're only hurting all of us with your discontentment and your complaining and your disobedience. The whip fell, and Samuel let out a grunt. Without rules, without order, all would be lost. Without law, there would be chaos. We can't just behave as wild animals, each doing whatever he pleases. We must all follow the plan and all do our duty for the betterment of everyone. And those who do not must be punished. The whip fell again, and blood flowed freely from Samuel's back. Samuel, it is you who are stealing from the others. When you don't do your assigned work, you are making more work for others. When you disobey the rules, it is you who are endangering the future of everyone else here. You are the thief. You are the criminal. You are the one trying to destroy the arrangement that keeps us all safe and prosperous. At every lash of the whip, the other workers cheered louder and louder, some yelling curses at Samuel. Being spoiled and selfish, you complain about everything, talking as if you're oppressed. But you are the one ruining things. You are the one keeping us from being all we could be. It is your greed and your rebelliousness that is hurting all of us. They all play by the rules, Mr. Smith said, gesturing at the others. What makes you think that you don't have to? You think you're above the law? There were loud yells of agreement as the whip fell again. We must maintain order, Mr. Smith proclaimed, to make this plantation great, to make it so that we can all be happy and prosperous. To have the society we want, there have to be rules. We all have to contribute our fair share to this great endeavor, and we cannot tolerate actions and attitudes that seek to undermine the amazing things that together as free men we have achieved and will continue to achieve. Mr. Jones was smiling as he gave Mr. Smith a pat on the back. The crowd was cheering so loudly that none of them had noticed that Samuel had died.
What you have been taught about government and politics is no more accurate or reasonable than what Mr. Smith taught the slaves. If you're ready to look through the veil of rhetoric and propaganda to see the reality beneath, get a copy of The Most Dangerous Superstition. It will change the way you see the world.
Today we will learn different methods you can use to be a crook.
Method 1.
The unsophisticated, short-sighted crook confronts a person directly and threatens him, usually while brandishing a weapon, and demands whatever money or other valuables the person has on him. While this method is fairly popular and sometimes effective, it has some drawbacks. For example, confronting someone in person poses a significant risk to you, the crook. Even if you only pick on smaller, weaker individuals, you never know when they might be armed. Furthermore, using this direct method involves a high likelihood that sooner or later you will be recognized, tracked down, and punished, whether by the victim, a bystander, or the police. And after you've done the crime, you get what you get, whatever your victim happened to have on him, and that's it. A one-time deal, usually with an unknown prize, maybe even nothing.
Method 2.
A slightly better way to be a crook is to break into houses when no one is around and see what you can steal. While there is some chance that you'll be noticed and confronted, the risk is a lot lower. And the average house is likely to contain a lot more valuables than the average person carries around with him. Nonetheless, there are still risks involved, and a high chance that you'll leave behind evidence, footprints, fingerprints, etc., that could later get you into trouble.
Method 3.
The more sophisticated crook avoids the risk of violent confrontation entirely by using fraud and deception rather than direct threats and violence. For example, you might call up little old ladies and trick them into giving you their credit card numbers, or set up some mail order scam that collects money and then magically disappears. The personal risk to you, especially the risk of being physically attacked by your intended victim, decreases dramatically. However, you might still get caught, and each time is still a one-shot deal. You get what you get and run the risk of getting in trouble, one crime at a time.
Method 4.
The next step up is to create ongoing frauds, methods that don't just rob people once, but that create recurring theft. For example, if you trick little old ladies into giving you their credit card numbers, instead of just having a quick shopping spree, you could set up a bunch of smaller, repeating thefts. A little old lady who gets charged $9.95 a month, which shows up on her credit card statement as helping poor orphans, is unlikely to question it. Get 100 little old ladies to do it, and you have an ongoing cash stream, without having to commit a new crime and incur new risks every time. Of course, there is still some risk of getting caught and punished.
Method 5.
A far better method of theft than any discussed so far is counterfeiting. While this requires serious technical and logistical resources, it has huge advantages. First of all, there is no direct victim who will even notice having been robbed. By printing fake money, you are actually robbing everyone who uses the currency. However, not only will they not notice the difference, but most people don't even comprehend why counterfeiting is bad or how it hurts anyone. The risk of your actual victims retaliating against you is therefore almost zero. The risk of them even knowing they were robbed is also almost zero, and wouldn't be much higher even if they knew you were printing your own cash, simply because most people have no idea what money is or how currency works. Once you're set up, you can create an ongoing source of wealth for yourself with very little physical risk. Of course, if the authorities find out, then you're in trouble. But aside from that risk, this would seem to be the pinnacle of the art of being a crook, having an unlimited supply of completely unearned wealth for yourself, while the victims never know what hit them, and in fact, never know that anything hit them.
Method 6.
The next step is only for truly sociopathic crooks, who don't just want unearned wealth, but want to dominate their fellow man. It's again based on counterfeiting, but instead of just printing money and buying stuff with it, you print money and loan it to other people. At first, this may seem counterintuitive. If you can just print as much money as you want, why bother to loan it or give it away? Well, suppose you print up millions of dollars and then lend that to hundreds of different people. They will each then feel indebted to you, as if you did them a favor. From then on, they will rob themselves every month, giving you a pile of money, while feeling a moral obligation to do so. Ironically, because they imagine the debt to be real, as if you actually loaned them your own money, they would view themselves as the crooks if they ever stopped going along with your crime. In fact, you should sometimes intentionally lend your counterfeit money out to the point where you know that people can't possibly pay it back. Why? Because when they default on the phony loans of your phony money, you can openly steal their houses, cars, and other property by way of foreclosure, and they will feel bad about it, as if they were the bad guys for not being able to keep up with the payments. While you openly steal everything they have, they will apologize for not giving you more while feeling shame and humiliation. What could be better? And the more you steal via this method, the more you can expand the fraud. There is really no limit. Eventually, if all goes well, you can have almost everyone in the world feeling indebted to you. And when they default, you will quite literally own the world. And most of your billions of victims will have no idea what happened. They will all be reduced to impoverished slaves for you to do with as you please, you sadistic, megalomaniacal, sociopathic bastard.
Method 7.
The previously mentioned method is so effective, in fact, that there's really only one way to improve it. The only risk involved up to this point is that the authorities might notice and catch you before you can slip off to some non-extradition treaty country with your ill-gotten gains. To remove that final risk, take the final step and bribe the politicians to legalize your crimes. When the authorities have given their official legislative blessing to your massive perpetual fraud, and even offer to send their mercenaries to protect you against your victims, should any of them ever wise up to what you're doing, Then you will be the supreme crook of the world. However, you cannot accomplish this. You will never be the super crook who owns the world. Why not? Because someone else beat you to it. In this country, they're called the Federal Reserve. They own Congress, which legalized their fraud in 1913. Since then, through their politically sanctioned fractional reserve banking scam, a fancy term for legalized counterfeiting, they have stolen more trillions of dollars in assets than you can possibly imagine. The crime is so perfect that they even do it right out in the open, admitting all of the details of the scheme. And still, only a tiny fraction of their victims have any idea what happened, or even have any idea that anything nasty has happened at all. However, if something like this video, for example, were to go viral, so that the victims of this fraud all understood what had been done to them, well, what would happen then remains to be seen.
Hey, Larken Rose here, and I thought it was high time I did a video about the questions to ask statists, anybody who advocates government of any variety, to demonstrate that they cannot be consistent even inside their own heads and believe in government. I know that sounds weird if you're not already familiar with this. These are the 5 questions I'm going to be including in my Government on Trial project, which is to be sent to 100, well, at this point we're probably going to send it to 200 political philosophy professors across the country. I'm going to put the link in the description to that project if you want to help support it. The more support we get, the more professors we can include. 5 very simple questions. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to comprehend these. However, no matter how many degrees or how many years of education you have, nobody can answer these simple questions without either contradicting themselves or giving up the belief in government. So here we go. Number 1, is there any means by which any number of individuals can delegate to someone else the moral right to do something which none of the individuals have the moral right to do themselves? And number 2 is related to that. Do those who wield political power, presidents, legislators, etc., have the moral right to do things which other people do not have the moral right to do? If so, from whom and how did they acquire such a right? Now, most people instinctively and obviously grasp that the answer is no, you can't give a right you don't have. But that logically means that those in government, like Congress, doesn't have the right to do anything that we don't have the right to do, because who had that right to give them? Nobody. And so this very simple question cannot be answered unless you acknowledge that government doesn't actually have any special authority, because we couldn't have given it to them. And yet all of political mythology rests on the assumption that that's possible, to give rights you don't have. Number 3, is there any process, such as constitutions, elections, or legislation, by which human beings can transform an immoral act into a moral act without changing the act itself? Again, a simple question, and most people instinctively say, no, you can't alter morality. You can't do some weird ritual and make bad into good. Well, if you can't, then there can't be such thing as political authority. Number 4, when lawmakers and law enforcers use coercion and force in the name of law and government, do they bear the same responsibility for their actions that anyone else would who did the same thing on his own? Nazis at Nuremberg, we were just following orders. Or any cop in the US, hey, I don't make the law, I just enforce it. Does that make it okay? Does legislation make it okay to do things which would be bad if anyone else did them? Simple questions, simple concepts. You won't hear them discussed in the mainstream media or in most of academia, which is why I'm doing the Government on Trial project. Last but not least, number 5, when there's a conflict between an individual's own moral conscience and the commands of a political authority, is the individual morally obligated to do what he personally views as wrong in order to obey the law? Again, it's a simple question, and most people would say, well, you can't be obligated to do the wrong thing, which is the obvious answer. However, if you can't be obligated to disobey your own conscience, there cannot be such thing as an external authority that you have an obligation to obey, that outranks your conscience. Feel free to try out these questions on anybody. It doesn't have to be a philosophy professor. Anybody can comprehend the concepts, and nobody who believes in government can consistently and coherently and rationally answer the questions. It's completely impossible. If anybody doubts that, I'm waiting to hear your answers. Go for it. Now, those familiar with what I do may recognize that basically this is just a question version of my disproofs of authority found in my book, The Most Dangerous Superstition, which you can get from Amazon.com or from my own website. But I challenge anyone, whatever fancy degrees you do or don't have, to answer these simple questions and be consistent and rational and still hang on to your belief in government, because it simply cannot be done.
Howdy, Larken Rose here. I'm feeling slightly less than entirely patient and polite today, so if this video gets slightly caustic, too bad. This video is for all the people who are constantly saying, well, if not for government, we couldn't have roads, or we couldn't have police, or nobody would care for the poor, or we wouldn't be protected, whether it's from local thugs or from foreign invaders. We wouldn't have this, we wouldn't have that. So thank goodness we have government and taxes, because we wouldn't have any of those things. And the first way I'd respond to that is by pointing out the assumptions that underlie that complaint, that argument. Basically what people are saying, because let's be clear about what the terms mean, government is the people who boss everybody else around. And taxes are those people demanding money from us. So they basically tell us, hand over a whole bunch of money and we'll decide how to take care of you. We'll decide how to spend your money. If we don't like it, too bad, we don't really have a choice. Like, well, you can vote in a few years and maybe something will change, even though it totally won't. So that's what people are saying. Basically, if we didn't have a ruling class stealing our money and then supposedly spending it to protect us, how could we possibly have roads or anybody to protect us? The implication is that in this country, for example, 300 million people would just sit around thinking, oh, we can't do it. Without politicians and tax collectors, we can't have a road, we can't protect each other, and we can't... And it rests on this bizarre assumption that things that almost everybody wants, they wouldn't do anything to make happen unless there were politicians forcing us to give them money so they can make it happen. And so an example I like to use is, let's apply the same argument to food, because food is pretty darn important. I think everybody can agree. Let's apply the same argument that statists use about the roads or caring for the poor or protection or anything like that. The argument would go like this. Now, in the context of food, listen how idiotic this is. If we don't have government demanding money from all of us under the threat of caging us, and that's what taxation is, here's the money you have to give us, here's the nasty things we do to you if you don't. If that didn't happen so that they could build a big food production and distribution system and feed us, well, we'd all starve. We'd all just sit around saying, gosh, I wish we had food, but no politicians and tax collectors. We're just going to sit around and starve to death. Now, in this country, nobody would believe something that stupid, because all you have to do is go to a supermarket and see a perfect example of really efficient, organized cooperation that nobody is forced to do. There is no, if you're going to make the argument that people make about roads and protection and all that, you'd say, well, nobody is forced to make any food for anybody in this country. How do you know everyone's just going to say, well, it's not my job, and we'll all starve to death? There's no guarantee. There's no master plan guaranteeing that we'll all have food. So obviously we're all going to starve if we don't have an authoritarian government stealing our money and then making food and giving it to us. Because golly gee, we couldn't possibly do it voluntarily ourselves. Again, in this country, nobody makes that argument because they see it happening voluntarily. Nobody involved is forced to do that. Nobody is forced to make you a single bite of food. There is no guarantee at all from anybody. And yet, Americans are, by and large, hugely overweight. Obviously, we don't have a lack of food. We might have a lack of healthy food. But obviously, we see that example, oh, we can handle that. voluntarily mutual cooperation, that's fine for food, but for some reason it's not okay, and we can't even fathom the idea of the exact same thing handling roads or handling protecting us or other things that almost everybody wants. So there's, in the question is this bizarre assumption that everybody will sit around really, really, really wanting something, but because there aren't politicians bossing us around and stealing our money, well, how could we possibly do it? And one of the most common things is, who will build the roads? Which is amazingly stupid to me. Just amazingly stupid. I have here in my pocket a little tiny thing. With this little tiny thing, I can be most places in this country and call people all over the world. And I own it myself. I'm not anywhere near rich these days, but I own one. Almost everybody I know has one of these. A little thing that can fit in your pocket, and just on a whim, you can open it and talk to somebody who's on the other side of the planet. And there was no coercion. Nobody forced anybody to make one of these. This is the result of voluntary cooperation. And that's it. Free trade. Organization, yeah, good. Cooperation, yeah, good. Coercion, which is what government is, and taxation, which is theft, didn't need that to do this. So what these people are telling me, oh, we wouldn't have roads if we didn't have government, is that somehow free individuals, relatively free, interacting voluntarily can make it so I can talk to almost anybody in the world on a little thing that fits in my pocket on a budget that is not a very good budget at the moment, but I still have one of these. That freedom, not authoritarianism, can supply me with this, but freedom cannot achieve a flat place. Because that's what a road is. It's a flat place. From here to there, because we have these machines that take us from here to there. By the way, we don't have those machines because of government. We have those machines because of free enterprise and voluntary interaction and cooperation. The idea that freedom can make a car but can't make a flat place is just idiotic. You really think we can't make a flat place? And so I ask people, and they say, well, who will build roads? Are you really telling me that you really and truly think that if government fell off the face of the earth, 300 million people in this country, 7 billion if you want to include the whole planet, would sit around in their houses thinking, golly, I wish I could go visit Fred, but I can't because there's not a flat thing from me to him, and I don't know how to do it. And the other 300 million or 7 billion people, we can't possibly do it because there aren't any politicians and tax collectors. If they were here, we could do it. If they were here to boss us around and steal our money and really inefficiently build a flat place, then we'd be set. Then I'd be comfortable and I could be confident that I could get places. I could visit Fred, I could go shopping, but now we're all going to sit in our houses wishing we could go to the corner store, but we can't because, golly, how could we possibly make a flat place from here to there? We can make these, where you can talk to anybody in the world. We can make machines that you drive around in, but no, we couldn't possibly make a flat place. And when people say, well, who will build the roads? The first answer is the same damn people who do it now. Politicians and tax collectors don't build the friggin' roads. Have you ever seen one out there? No, you haven't. They steal our money, waste most of it, do all their corrupt games, and then they pay other people. Here's an idea. How about if we pay those other people who actually build the stinking road? And the fact that that doesn't occur to people is a great indication of how well indoctrinated people are by the rulers who will perpetually tell us, you can't organize anything, you can't achieve anything, you can't do anything unless we are here to force it on you. And it's, again, there are a zillion examples, whether it's caring for the poor or protection or roads, obviously, where most of the population will say, I'm really concerned that poor people won't be taken care of, which means most of the population wants people in need to be taken care of. And if we didn't have politicians stealing our money, how would it happen? Here's an idea. Take some money out of your pocket and give it to one of the people that you think needs help. Why would you not comprehend that, but you would comprehend some guy 1,000 miles away passing a law to send an armed thug to take your money, to waste 90% of it, and then give a little bit to somebody who may just be defrauding the system or may actually need it? And the amount of indoctrination required to make people even ask these questions of how could we possibly do this without government? What do you think government adds to the equation? It doesn't add any resources. It doesn't create anything. Everything it gives away, it steals from us first, by way of taxation. It doesn't add any skills. It doesn't add any knowledge. The people who are here would still be here if the institution of government fell over. We have all the know-how, we have all the resources, all the technology. The only thing it adds is one group that's imagined to have the right to violently assault and control and extort everybody else. So what the question really means is, how could we have a road, or how could I help that poor, or how could that poor person be helped, or how would anybody protect us if there wasn't a gang of thugs with permission to violently control and rob us? And when you recognize that that is literally what the question means, you already see how utterly idiotic it is. And it's completely the result of authoritarian statist indoctrination. Nobody would come up with that on their own. And you obviously don't see that with the example of food or cars or cell phones or anything else. Nobody says, we won't be able to talk to each other unless there's a gang of thugs that's allowed to boss us around and steal our money. And just economically, how stupid you have to be to think that's a good idea. Here are your choices. Let's do this. I'll give you these two choices for how you will be fed from now on. Either you can go spend your own money wherever you want. You can go to the supermarket or the local this or the local grocery, whatever you want. You can go decide what you want, and they'll tell you the price. You decide what you're going to buy and how much. And you can go to different places and you can shop around and you can do all that. That's option number one. But let me warn you, option number one does not give any guarantee that you will be fed. There's no master plan forcing people to feed you. So, oh my gosh, you better be really scared of that option, despite the fact that you can do it day after day and it works really darn well and feeds pretty much not only this country, but with a massive surplus. So that's option number one that apparently statists are scared of. Option number two is politicians will take as much money of yours as they decide to take. Then they will decide what, if anything, they will buy with that money in terms of food to give to you, to feed you. Do you really think that will serve you better, that will feed you better? Yeah, I'm much more comfortable that I'll have I'll be fed, I'll be secure, everything will be okay. If a gang of thugs who doesn't really care about me steals my money and then decides what, if anything, to give me back from what they stole. But that is implied in the question, whatever you put in the blank. How are we going to have blank if not for government? What you're saying is, how can we, the people who really want roads and food and cell phones and protection and all the things that almost everybody wants, how can we possibly have that unless we give someone permission to steal our money and boss us around and then decide what they're going to give us? And the same thing applies no matter what you put in the blank. How will we possibly do blank without government? One of the silly ones is caring for the poor. How will we care for the poor? Think of what that means. Like when more than half the country votes for a party to take care of the poor, it's more than half of the country saying, we're really concerned and we want to make sure that the less fortunate are taken care of, but we don't believe that normal people acting in freedom will take care of them. Well, if the people didn't care about the poor, they wouldn't win the election. By definition, if you vote for a welfare state, you're an idiot. Because either people are heartless bastards and you're going to lose, or people are compassionate and giving and you don't need to win. Just give them your stinking money. But people play the game, and that's the Democratic Party lives off of the idiotic notion that you're all so heartless that you should vote for us to steal your money to give to the poor. And half the country falls for it. Yeah, we're all so heartless that we voted you into office for the specific purpose of taking our money to help the less fortunate. That's just freaking brilliant. How about if half the country just gave their stinking money to the less fortunate? And then the less fortunate would all be rich, because it would be 1 trillion times more efficient than the government version of welfare ever is. Also, it would be actual charity instead of mass theft and corruption and fraud and all that fun stuff. But what takes the cake, the ultimately insane thing, whatever you put in that gap, how can we have blank without a parasitic ruling class and a bunch of hired thieves? It's just a stupid question, but it's extra super stupid when what's in the blank is, how will we be protected? Who will protect us from thieves and robbers if we don't have government? It's the most idiotic question. It's also the most frequent question from statists. So here's what the question literally means. If we don't give a certain gang of people permission to violently control us and take our money under threat of putting us in a cage, who will protect us from people who might commit aggression against us and take our money? Wanting government for that is exactly as brilliant as saying, we have to have a carjacker in our town, otherwise somebody might steal our cars. Government is an appointed thief. If you don't think taxation is theft, first of all, you're a really well-trained slave. Second of all, try not paying. See what happens. See if they say, oh, it's quite all right. Or if they say, no, you're going to pay, or we're going to take your stuff, or eventually we'll put you in a cage. And when people say, that's not theft, because we get something back. Learn to think. And I use this example all the time, and all I ever get is stupid looks from statists in response. If I robbed you at gunpoint of $100, and the next day I gave you a sandwich, and you said, what? I said, hey, now everything's fine, because you benefited. I gave you a service. I gave you lunch, so that retroactively makes it okay that I robbed you at gunpoint. Would you buy that argument? No, you'd say, that doesn't make it okay. Okay, you gave me a sandwich. And yet every statist makes the exact same argument when it comes to government. Well, we get some stuff for it after they demand our money under threat of violence and putting us in a cage. Then we get services or goods. And we don't get what we asked for, and we get lots of things we didn't ask for. But we kind of get something, and that retroactively makes it okay for them to say, give us this much of every paycheck you make, or we're sending men with guns to take your property. And the slaves justify their own enslavement. I'm proud to pay my taxes. I'm proud to get robbed by a parasitic ruling class and get a little bit back and feel good about it. Like, not only is that legitimate and justified, but I feel proud that I let myself get robbed by a bunch of crooks and parasites. But again, the ultimate thing is protection. When people say, who will protect us from aggressors and thugs and thieves if we don't have a government? Even though what government is, by its very nature, is a gang of aggressors and thugs and thieves. They issue commands. Every law they pass is a command backed by a threat of violence. You have to do this. You're not allowed to do that. Here are the nasty things we will do to you if you get caught disobeying. I mean, everybody knows that, even though they don't usually say it in terms that blunt and honest and accurate. But to say we need taxes to be protected is as stupid as you can get. It's saying we need theft to avoid theft. And the fact that people are trained to use different words so that this theft sounds okay. It's legalized, it's taxation, and we voted for the people who robbed us. Like, we got to elect our local carjacker, and that means he represents us when he demands our car and points a gun in our face. He's serving us as he steals our car, because he's going to use that car and sell it and make money to make sure nobody else steals our car. That is the essence of government. And the fact that you have hundreds of millions of victims of that scam vehemently defending it and saying, I'm not going to give that up. I don't want to give up government. Who would protect us? I don't want to give up the biggest aggressor on the planet, the biggest thief on the planet. Look at your tax bill and see how much private crooks steal from you. So before you ask that question, before you ask, how could we possibly have roads or protection or water or air or Christmas or Santa Claus or any of the zillion things that statists imagine we can't possibly have without a ruling class, think about what the question actually means. Because when you get to the point where you understand the implications of your own question, asking, how can we possibly have this without a parasitic gang of thugs robbing us? When you actually understand what you're really asking, You won't ask the question because you will realize it's completely freaking idiotic. How about you start by learning how to talk to other people to get them to give up their statism?